بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So inshallah, in today's lecture we are going to talk about the beginnings of the surahs of the Quran, meaning the letters that begin the 29 chapters of the Quran, like Alif Lam Mim, Qaf, Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ain, Sad, Noon, etc. We're going to talk about the significance of that. We're going to talk about the different opinions that the ulama have in explaining what those letters mean, why they begin the chapters, and we will look a little bit about some of the miracles that, or some of the miracles is the right word, some of the miracles that we can find, because the letters that begin the chapters of the Quran are 14 and there are 28 letters of the alphabet. So half the letters of the alphabet begin the chapters and half don't. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and spend some time looking at the differences of opinion about what those means. But the majority of the lecture is going to be in the following, which is talking about the compilation of the Quran. How did we go from pure revelation to the mushaf that we have in the hand today? What were the stages of the Quran being compiled? So we're going to look at the compilation of the Quran during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, and then we are going to look at the compilation of the Quran during the Khilafah of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and what his efforts in bringing the Quran together into one volume. And then of course we will look at the last compilation that took place during the Khilafah of Sayyidina Uthman, the third Khalifa radiallahu anhu, and not only the compiling of the Quran, but also the standardizing of the script of the Quran, which is what we call the Uthmanic script. So this second subject matter will take up the bulk of the lecture, because we're going to talk about some of the traditions of how the committees were formed to compile the Quran, what rules they had to compile the Quran and bring the verses together in a specific order and to follow a specific script, and how that has led to ultimately the publication of the Quran that we have in our hands today. So these are the major topics. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so let us look at the beginning of the surahs of the Quran, the letters that begin the different chapters. If you look at the Arabic alphabet as having 29 letters, with the alif and the hamza as being two distinct letters, then it's interesting that there are 29 surahs of the Quran that begin with those letters. Usually we count the letters as being 28, in which case another interesting thing about this is that 14 of the 28 are the letters that begin the surahs of the Quran. And an easy mnemonic device that you can use to remember it is the following sentence: Nassun Hakimun Qati'un Lahu Sir. That entire sentence, Nassun Hakimun Qati'un Lahu Sir. A wise statement that is absolute in it is a secret. That's the sentence. Every single letter of that sentence, which are 14 letters, are the 14 letters that make up the beginnings of the surahs of the Quran. Nassun Hakimun Qati'un Lahu Sir. So if you just memorize that, then you'll be able, if you write it out, then you'll be able to write out for yourself all of the letters that begin the Quran. There are three major opinions about what these letters mean. First of all, before I get into the opinions, when you get into the larger tafsir, like the more like encyclopedic type of tafsirs, I call them encyclopedic. I'm thinking of something like Ar-Razi or Tabari. Of course, we classified them slightly different when we did the lecture on tafsir. So I'm not contradicting myself. I'm just saying when I say encyclopedic, I mean like the really big tafsir, like voluminous ones. You tend to find a lot of discussion about these points, regardless of if it's tafsir athari, if it's tafsir fiqhi, if it's tafsir ishari. Regardless of what kind of tafsir it is, the longer the tafsir, the more the chance is that you're going to have a discussion about what these letters are. So for people that are interested in that, and I think it's an interesting thing, I know of no other book, whether it be revealed book or human authored book, that has this type of style of just letters that begin the chapters. You'll find the discussion in those longer tafsir. The first opinion is that these letters that begin those 29 surahs are the names of those surahs, and this is supported by some of the hadith, like for example the hadith that's narrated by Ahmed, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, Yasin qalbul Quran. So we call Surah Yasin Yasin, we call it Yasin. So if I said Surah Yasin or Yasin, read Yasin, you're going to know that that's Surah Yasin. Another hadith that's narrated by Al-Bazzar and At-Tirmidhi, the Prophet ﷺ said, Man qara ayat al-kursi wa hamim al-mu'min usima dhalika al-yawm min kulli su. Whoever reads ayat al-kursi, we know what that is in Surah Al-Baqarah, and hamim, Surah Al-Mu'minun, then they are saved or protected that day. So there are many traditions of the Prophet, many hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ referred to the name of that surah using those letters. Alif Lam Mim As-Sajda. That's another one. Okay, so that means Surah As-Sajda, and the Prophet ﷺ referred to it as Alif Lam Mim. So the first opinion, and the opinion that the Shaykh, our author, Shaykh Nuruddin Layth, rahimahullah, has adopted, is that the letters that begin the surahs are the names of the surahs. A second opinion states is that the letters are there to prove the miracle of the Quran. One of those miracles of the Quran is that, like for example, Qaf, you can't take out Qaf and put in its place Noon. I mean, in other words, each letter combination, whether it's a singular letter, a double letter, 3 letters, or 4, which is also interesting because the Arabic language has those type of roots. If you substituted them with another one, the whole surah would not gel, because like Qaf, there are many ayat that have the letter Qaf in it, or it will end in the letter Qaf, for example. And this is something that Az-Zarakshi rahimahullah pointed out. So there's a balance in those letters being chosen to begin the surahs, and therefore the second opinion says this demonstrates the miraculous nature of the Quran. And then the third opinion says that these letters are either names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or like names of the Prophet, like we say Yasin and Taha are names of the Prophet ﷺ, or Yasin is Ya Insan. In other words, that the letters mean something. That's a third opinion. Again, they're just different opinions of ijtihad. As I said, the author of the book prefers the first opinion because of the evidentiary support that he has from that. Another thing I'll add, it's not necessarily in the book, but I think is also interesting, is that the moon, there are 28 stations of the moon. So the moon waxes, it gets bigger for 14 states, and then it gets smaller, it wanes for 14 states until there's the birth of the new moon. So some of the ulama of the letters likened the letters that opened up, the 14 letters that opened up the Quranic chapters, as the waxing states of the moon, and they call them al-huruf al-nuraniyya, the letters of light. And then the other 14 letters that don't make up the beginnings of the mushaf, of the surah, as the 14 waning states of the moon, and they call them al-huruf al-dhulmaniyya. Again, I'm just showing you some of the breadth and the ijtihad of the ulama in understanding. You're perfectly fine with following the dominant position that says that they are those letters are the names of the surahs. And the reason I referenced in the very beginning the encyclopedic tafsir is because you're going to find a lot of these nuanced understandings in the tafsir, in those longer tafsir. Now the Shaykh has a long footnote. I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but he talks about the numerical people that are adding letters and trying to have some kind of number tafsir of the Quran as being a flawed approach. I don't think it's as popular now as it used to be, but there was an attempt in the past to do that. And that's not how we understand the Quran. There are some numerical, interesting things. I think the word month, the shahr, is mentioned 12 times in the Quran. There are interesting things that you'll come up with. That's fine. You can benefit from that. But the Quran is not meant to be made into ones and zeros and input it as an algorithm. That's not what the Quran is for. Okay, so this is chapter 17, Fawatih as-Sur. Now let us move to chapter 18, which will occupy the rest of this lecture, inshallah, which is the compilation of the Quran. The first thing off the bat is he mentions 4 sources that I think are very interesting. I want to mention them to you, that talk about the history of this. The first one is Kitab al-Masahif by Ibn Abi Dawood. The second book is Al-Masahif by Ibn Ashta, who's unfamiliar to me, unfortunately. Number 3 is Al-Intisar li-Naql al-Quran. This is by Al-Baqillani, who died in the year 403, famous Ash'ari theologian, Al-Qadi al-Baqillani. And then the last book he mentions is Nukat al-Intisar li-Naql al-Quran by Imam al-Sayrafi. And alhamdulillah, all 3 of these, my understanding is that all 3 of these are published. So those are sources for people that want to delve into this subject a little bit more. So, we've talked, if you remember way back in the first and second lecture, we talked about the nature of revelation, and we talked about how the Prophet ﷺ would receive revelation. And of course, we know that the revelation took place piecemeal over time, over the span of 23 years. And as the Quran was being revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, he would immediately inform the Sahaba of what was revealed, and then the Sahaba would write it down and or memorize it. And that's the first point that I want you to remember, is that the Quran was actually written from the very beginning. And as a matter of fact, so was the hadith. A lot of people forget that as well. There are many traditions in which the Prophet ﷺ tasked certain Sahaba with writing down the hadith as well. But the more famous understanding is the Quran. So let's just stick with the Quran. We can talk about the hadith in another class. So when we talk about the first stage of the compilation of the Quran, we're talking about the stage of the Prophet ﷺ himself receiving revelation and then immediately informing the companions. What do the companions immediately do? Some of them memorize it, and then some of them write it down. Let me pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, so we're saying that when the Prophet ﷺ would receive revelation over that 23-year period of time, he would immediately state and declare what he received publicly to the companions. And in that, the Prophet ﷺ asked and ordered some of the companions to write down what he had recited. Of course, we know that Jibreel alayhi salam came to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam in the month of Ramadan, in the beginning of the revelation, the Laylatul Qadr. And then the Prophet ﷺ used to do i'tikaf every Ramadan, and in the final year he did i'tikaf for 20 days, in which Jibreel alayhi salam came and reviewed the Quran with the Prophet alayhi salatu twice. Now, some of these things that aided in the initial compilation of the Quran was, number 1, the natural ability of the Arabs at this time to memorize. So memory was something that they were very good at, and that it was a natural feature that they had. Number 2, that we have to read the Quran or use the Quran in the prayer. So it's not like the Quran is the holy book and we don't use it. So it's the holy book and you have to use it in the Quran, in the prayer. So there's the Fard prayers, there's the Sunnah prayers, there's the Tahajjud prayer, which almost everyone did at that time. So there's a frequent usage of the Quran. Number 3 is that the Quran was revealed piecemeal. And that's another important feature. It wasn't revealed all at once, but was revealed a little bit at a time. Number 4 is that we are always using the Quran because it informs our belief and it forms our conduct. So day-to-day conduct, day-to-day issues of belief are always going to be answered by going back to the Quran. Number 5, the Prophet himself ﷺ encouraged the people to recite the Quran, and informed them of the great reward of reciting the Quran. So it became an act of devotion itself, just reciting the Quran. And then lastly, the Prophet ﷺ ordered the companions to teach the Quran. So whatever the Prophet ﷺ would send a delegation to a new tribe that had just embraced Islam, he would also send with them somebody that can teach them the sha'air, the how to wash and pray and things like that, and fast, pay zakat. But he also sent with them somebody who can teach them the Quran, al-Qurra, those who could read the Quran. Okay. The Prophet ﷺ, as I said, would receive the revelation, and it was immediately written. I prepare for these lectures, and then I know where the pages are, and then when I come and hit record, I lose the page. So sorry, sometimes I have to fumble through the pages to find. Okay, here it is. And then the Prophet ﷺ would order the Quran to be written down. It would be written down on parchments, on bones, on skins, things like that. Like everyone knows hopefully everyone knows the famous story of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, before he became Muslim, how he went to his sister and they had Surah Taha written down and they read from it. So that shows you, that's evidence that the Quran was written. Not written in one mushaf. That's what this whole lecture is about. How did we get to one mushaf? But it was written nonetheless. The Prophet ﷺ also had those people that were experts of the Quran. So like in one tradition, he says, take the Quran from 4. All of them are from the Ansar: Ubay ibn Ka'b, Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Zayd ibn Thabit, wa Abu Zayd. This is a hadith that's narrated in Bukhari. In another tradition, he says, take the Quran from 4. Abdullah bin Mas'ud, Salim, Mu'adh, Ubay ibn Ka'b. So the ulama that put together these hadiths, they say there's not just 4, because in other hadith he will mention Uthman ibn Affan, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, Abdullah bin Mas'ud, wa Abu Darda, wa Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, so on and so forth. So Imam Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, in his book on the Qira'at, he says these are the companions, and this is a longer list of the companions who were the experts of the Quran, who the other companions would take the Quran from. The 4 Khulafa, so Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Imam Ali alayhi salam, Talha ibn Ubaidullah, wa Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Abdullah bin Mas'ud, Hudhayfa ibn al-Yamani, Saliman Mawla Abi Hudhayfa, Abu Huraira, Abdullah ibn al-Sa'ib, wal-Abadila, that is Abdullah ibn Umar and Abdullah ibn Abbas and Abdullah ibn Amr ibn al-As and Abdullah ibn Zubayr, also Aisha alayhi salam, Hafsa alayhi salam, and Salama alayhi salam. As for the Ansar, we've mentioned Ubadah ibn Samit, Mu'adh Abu Halima, ومجمع بن جارية, وفضالة ibn Ubaid, ومسلمة bin Mukhallad. And these are just a list. This is not an exhaustive list. So there were experts of the Quran, and at the same time, as I mentioned, the Prophet ﷺ would order that the Quran would be written, and he would order them not to write anything else that he would say. لا تكتبوا عني شيئا إلا القرآن. Do not write anything I say except the Quran. فمن كتب عني شيئا غير القرآن فليمحه. Anybody who writes something of what I say other than the Quran, let them erase it. This is the hadith that's narrated in Muslim. And because of this hadith, there's a misconception that the hadith was not written. But there are other traditions in which the Prophet ﷺ ordered, like Abdullah bin Umar radiallahu anhu, to write the hadith, and that's why we have something like a Sahif al-Sadiqa, which was one of the first original compilations of hadith. This is a very important note. I said I wasn't going to say it, and here I'm saying it again. But it's an important tangent, because I want you to keep in mind that both of the primary sources, there were written documentations from it, in addition to it being memorized. This is just our history, and we need to know that this is how the history came. Another important thing is that we have a lot of hadith that forbid us from traveling to enemy lands with the Quran. We also have hadith that forbid us from touching the Quran without wudu or without being in a state of tahara. Despite these are ahkam and they have their own bi'ah, their own environment in which they're applied. So this is not a class of fiqh. So I'm not here to talk about the differences of opinions about those issues, but simply to say because we have those rules, there was early on there was this idea that we have to hold on to the Quran and really only the Muslims can have it, to make sure that it didn't fall into enemy lines, wasn't adulterated or changed or altered, forged, so on and so forth. So those type of things that you have to approach the Quran with wudu, it's something that can't leave Dar al-Islam. This was a very significant part of the Quran, especially in the early generation, in this first mode, which is how the Quran was compiled during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So he's receiving revelation, alayhi salatu wasalam. He's piecemeal. He's immediately conveying what he receives because he's a prophet. That's his job. He has to do that. So he's not hiding anything. And then immediately the Sahaba are memorizing it and or writing it by the command of the Prophet ﷺ. And already there are those experts amongst the Sahaba who are the Qurra. So these are the main points for this period of time. What ends up happening is during the Khilafah of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, a lot of the Qurra, a lot of those experts of the Quran die in the Ridda wars. And this became like a national security crisis. I mean, this is the most after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Ar-Rafiq al-A'la. This is probably the greatest security crisis that faced the Muslim body politic, because what do we do now? The Prophet ﷺ told us to go to Fulan and Allan and Tirkan, to learn the Quran. Now they've gone. Well, who are going to be the experts of the Quran? And Islam, mashallah, is spreading such that there are non-Arabs that are now becoming Muslim. And of course, as we know, now most Muslims are not Arab. So this is not an Arab thing. But at the time, the thinking was like, well, how will we preserve the Quran? So it was the loss of the Qurra in the battles that will segue into this very interesting meeting between Sayyidina Abu Bakr, the Khalifa radiallahu anhu, one of his chief lieutenants, Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, and the young Sahabi Zayd ibn Thabit, who was given the enormous task of compiling the Quran. He said, if you asked me to move a mountain, it would have been easier for me. So we'll begin that story in the next clip, inshallah. So this is the story that's narrated in Bukhari on the authority of Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu. So he's the one that's narrating the story. And it's a very, beautiful, I find very moving, intimate vignette into how serious the Sahaba took the Quran. So Abu Bakr, the Khalifa now, Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, the Khalifa, received news of the great loss of life of the Qurra, those who were experts in the Quran during the battle of Al-Yamama. And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu came to him, and Umar told him, now Umar is his chief lieutenant now, one of the great Sahaba, one of the Ahlul Halli wal Aqd, he ends up becoming the second Khalifa. He's like, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, I'm worried. I'm worried that we're going to lose the Quran because we have lost all of the Qurra. For I think we should bring all of the parchments together and all of the experts together and produce one mushaf. Initially, Abu Bakr was against it. He said, how can I do something that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do? So Umar said, هذا والله خير. He said, by Allah, this is a good thing. This is a good thing. So Abu Bakr said, of course Zayd is narrating the story, but Abu Bakr said, I knew that Umar wouldn't say such a thing unless Allah Ta'ala had guided him to that. So he trusted in the mashura, he trusted in the counsel of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu. So they bring Zayd, and they said, Zayd radiallahu anhu, you're a young man, la nuttahimuka, you have an impeachable, you're beyond reproach, your reputation is perfect and intact, you're intelligent, we want you to do and compile the Quran. So he said the same thing, well, how can I do something that the Prophet ﷺ didn't do? And then they said, no, wallahi hadha khair, this is a good thing. So he realized that this was a guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he said, if they had asked me to move a mountain from place to place it would have been easier for me than what they tasked me with. And then Zayd begins, for lack of a better word, he forms the first committee to compile the Quran. And they form this committee with obviously the direction from the head of state, from Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and they put together certain conditions, which is that each verse that a Sahaba brings us, he will recite the verse, and we know that it's after the verse before it and it's before the verse after it, but we need two written documentations for that. And if you think about that, at the time in ancient Arabia, this is an unbelievable amount of scrutiny involved. It would have been completely sufficient. And if we had received the story this way, we would have been completely fine with it, that it was memorized, and the Arabs, the ancient Arabs at that time were good at memory, and they just had to have two people to verify the verse. That would have been fine. But the fact that they actually included the written documentation is something that I think is very, very significant. And then I lost the place I wanted to mention to you. Yes. And then they found the documentation that they needed for everything except for the last two verses in Surah At-Tawbah. Surah Al-Ahzab. And they found the written documentation with Khuzaymah, and there's a pre-story that goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, that the Prophet ﷺ testified to Khuzaymah, and he said, Khuzaymah, your testimony is worth the testimony of two people. And because he was the only Sahaba that had that, but his testimony was worth the testimony of two people, they accepted that into the Quran. Okay, so they brought the Quran together, and they produced the Mus'haf according to these parameters, and now they have a standard Mus'haf, but what was not standard was the script. So what was standard in the Mus'haf of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu was the order of the verses and the beginning and the ends of the surah, and that was it. They were not concerned with the other things that would come to be concerned during the time of Sayyidina Uthman. Now what happens with the Khilafah of Sayyidina Uthman, that Mus'haf stays with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He passes away. It took about a year for them to do that, and then it stayed with Umar radiallahu anhu during his Khilafah. And then after that, in the battle of Armenia and Azerbaijan, a lot of non-Muslims, non-Arabs become Muslim, and there start to be ikhtilaf, there starts to be differences of opinion of how certain verses are pronounced, going back to the ahruf that we talked about in a previous lecture. And then this created another fitna. So Sayyidina Uthman, the Khalifa now radiallahu anhu, brought Zayd again, Ibn Thabit, because now he's a veteran at this, to compile the Mus'haf and to make it one script, one rasm. And that's why we call it a rasm al-Uthmani. So he brought Zayd ibn Thabit radiallahu anhu, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, Sa'id ibn al-As, Abdul Rahman ibn al-Harith ibn Hisham. And then he said to the Qurayshis of them, he said, if you fall into disagreement, then write the script, spell the words according to the language of Quraysh, because it was revealed, the Quran was revealed with the language of Quraysh. So in this regard, the Uthmanic script was able to hold most of the differences of opinion of the words. in some of the examples that we talked about in the previous lecture, it's impossible that the Ottomanic script will hold those differences. Some of them are differences because of the dots. The Mus'haf of Sayyidina Abu Bakr was not written with the dots or shadda or diacritical marks or vowels or anything like that. This one was. So therefore, the script of the Ottomanic script can hold it. The other ahruf, the other languages of the 7 that the Quran was revealed, if it was not held in the script, it will make its way into the qira'at that we talked about as a separate issue that is transmitted also through tawatur. But here, the goal of the committee of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu was to standardize the script and choosing the script or the language of Quraysh for the Quran to be written in. So we've talked about like Maliki Yawmiddin in Surah Al-Fatiha. It's Mim, Alif, Lam, Kaf. That's how you write Maliki Yawmiddin. But the Uthmanic script is Mim, Lam, Kaf, Malik. So you could pronounce it Maliki with the hanging Alif, or you can pronounce it Maliki Yawmiddin. Both would be valid according to the two qir like that. One is Hafs and one is Warsh, for example. The second thing is that they took and they removed anything from the Mus'haf that was not the Quran. So maybe in some of the compilation of the Mus'haf of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, you might have had some of those verses in which like Salatul Wusta wa hiya al-Asr, the Wusta prayer, and that's Asr prayer, that would have been removed. And they said, Jarridul Mus'haf, Jarridu al-Masahif, completely remove anything from the Masahif that's not the Quran. So that became, that became the goal of the second committee. Now there were different narrations, but 6 copies were made, and the 7th was called the Imam's copy, the copy of Uthman. It was stayed with him, and these masahif were taken and spread out to the Muslim world. Copies were made from them, and then copies were made from those copies, so on and so forth, and that became the standard script of the Mus'haf, which we have received with tawatur, with diffuse congruence, without any ambiguity, anything lost, alhamdulillah. And this is the story of how the Quran, we come from revelation all the way to the Mus'haf that we have today, because the script of Uthman radiallahu anhu, the ulama that would transcribe the masahif thereon after, they also documented and codified the rules, because not all words are spelled the same way in every single place in the Mus'haf. That's also what could drive you crazy, is that it's not, you would think it's not consistent, but there is a rhyme and reason to it, but you have to know the rules. So those rules were compiled and so on and so forth until we have the standard Mus'haf. So that's the story of the compilation of the Mus'haf. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. In today's lecture, we were able to talk about the opening letters that open the 29 surahs of the Quran, and we learned that those 14 letters, which is half of the Arabic alphabet, that open those surahs, they make this interesting sentence, Nasun Hakimun Qati'un Lahu Sir, and every single letter in that sentence are those 14 letters. We talked about the difference opinion of interpreting what those letters mean. Some of them, the majority opinions say these are the names of the surah. Other people say it's to establish the miraculous nature of the Quran because it provides a balance of each chapter. And then other people will say that they indicate the names of Allah and the names of the Prophet ﷺ. The point of view is that there are differences of opinion, and as I said, you will find a lot of those nuances and details in the encyclopedic tafsir. And then the majority of the lecture was spent talking about the compilation of the Quran. The compilation of the Quran during the during the revelation of the Prophet ﷺ, how he would receive revelation and then the Sahaba would memorize and write it. And then how during the Khilafah of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, when many people who had memorized the Quran, the Qurra, died in the Yamama battle and the Ridda wars, that there was a fear that they would lose the Quran. So Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu advised him that we would compile the Quran in one Mus'haf. They brought Zayd ibn Thabit to do this, and we talked about the parameters that he put, that each verse has to have a double written verification in addition to the memory that's produced by the Sahabi that brings the verse. They ordered the Quran, and then that became the standard Mus'haf. And then during this Khilafah of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu anhu, during the opening of Azerbaijan and Armenia, when a lot of non-Arabs became Muslim, there started to become conflict of how certain passages and words would be pronounced. So Uthman redid the whole thing again with Zayd ibn Thabit, but they standardized the script of the Quran and they wrote the script in the language of Quraysh to be able to hold as much as they could of the other 6 ahruf, the 6 letters or languages that we talked about before. And that becomes, 6 or 7 copies were made of that mushaf, and from those masahif all the other ones were burned, and from those 7 all other masahif from that time forth came, and from that we get the rules of the rasm, the Uthmanic script, which we'll dedicate another lecture to inshallah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.